Another key topic of this year's forum is, of course, the reform of the International Monetary Fund. Well, the world has been calling for an increase of the IMF's resources. But, Professor, there has been much talk about the role of IMF. Why do we need to reform IMF in the first place?
Well, IMF, look, it's a company of shareholders. So unlike United Nations, where everyone has his own one vote. So IMF basically, if you have a big stockholder, shareholders like US, which has voting power of 17%, and there are others, smaller shareholders.
It's basically an international organization.
Yes.
It has to coordinate different stances of different nations.
It has to. The IMF has a total fund of about 250 billion US dollars, which is quite enough for ordinary financial crisis. But in case of big ones, especially for these ones, it's totally different ballgame.
But the reform of the International Monetary Fund has been going on for quite some time. Why did it take so long to get it done?
Well, it's a long story. The reasoning is this. After the Bretton Woods, the IMF is supposed to play a bigger role, but in Bank of International Settlement, it has really declined its roles in last 20 minutes.
What do you think are the most challenging work for IMF at the moment?
Oh, definitely this IMF needs to raise more funds and to use the funds efficiently to, say, rescue the world. So that's probably the most important thing that IMF is focusing on, that it needs funds.
Actually, despite all those differences, the financial and central bank chiefs of various countries have agreed to increase the funding of the International Monetary Fund and expedite its reform at the G20 Financial Summit. Let's take a look at the background of the IMF.
The International Monetary Fund was established in 1945 following World War II. Its original aim is to rebuild the international monetary order and stabilize the financial market. It has long dominated by the United States and developed countries. Europeans have the right to choose the IMF chief for years and currently have 32% of the IMF voting rights. The US has the largest single share with voting rights of 16.7%. China, despite being the world's third largest economy, only has a 3.6% share. Despite contributing greatly to the world financial system, the defects of IMF have become more and more obvious with the changing of the world economy in past years. Criticisms say it fails to act effectively to deal with the current crisis and does not reflect the realities of the 21st century, namely the growing importance of developing countries. Those factors have made the IMF reform all the more necessary. Developing countries are calling for effective steps that should be taken to increase their say and representation in the world monetary body. Meanwhile, IMF is now facing severe shortage in lending resources, and it said it should take substantial reform on voting rights and governance structure to bolster its credibility and pull more funds from emerging economies. 吉田新 CCTV.
As said, reform of how IMF is funded is definitely needed. So, in your opinion, what is the easiest and most practical way for the international organization to get its resources?
The easiest way at the current status is to have the big shareholders of IMF, which gives them more funds. But in this case, it's United States, UK, and all the major European countries plus Japan. Now, obviously, they're not in a position of giving them more funds. So the practical way is to have the developing countries, or even some of the wealthier developing countries like China,
Saudi Arabia, Brazil.
Yes, that money comes from them. That will be much easier simply because they have a lot of foreign reserves.
Actually, Chinese officials have said that China will buy bonds issued by IMF. What's your understanding of such a stance from China?
Okay. Well, China does make such an offering from Vice Premier Wang Qishan. But you have to notice that there's a difference between buying bonds from IMF and buying bonds from the United States, the government bond. And they have different risks. And also from the perspective of IMF, selling bonds to China is different from raising funds from its shareholders. So these are very complicated issues. And China is making such an offering, I think, in good confidence.
As you said, the contributions need a lot of the efforts from those BRIC countries. So do you think those developing countries will make their own say in the decision-making process when they make more contributions to the IMF?
Currently, that the BRIC countries, their voting powers altogether is about 10%. And in IMF, you want to pass any resolutions, you need 85% of the vote. So altogether, they're not enough. But United States has 70% voting power. So in this sense, the United States as one country can veto any IMF resolution, but together all the BRIC countries, they cannot. Therefore, I think it's time for the BRIC countries to raise its voice and want more voting powers in IMF.
So in that case, the U.S. will be facing a situation with declining powers in the IMF framework. Do you think the U.S. will buy into this idea?
Well, it's a tough one. That's why the U.S. is so allergic to when Chinese officials said that we need a new global currencies. Yeah. And I understand that, if you understand that the IMF is really a company with share voting powers, the struggle between shareholders is very political. It's not just financially. Yeah. And that's why the U.S. want to maintain its power, but in this case, it's probably paralyzed.
So, do you believe it will be the case that in the future, the head of the IMF and World Bank will still be European and American alternately?
Well, I am pretty confident in the near future that the head of World Bank and the head of IMF will be alternating, say, between U.S. citizens and the European unions and probably some Asian countries.
Okay. Thank you.